Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Build Climate Smart, Preparing Canada's Built Environment for Climate Change. My name is Felix, and I'm the webinar coordinator at the Continuing Education Department here at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from today. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we commence, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window. Feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speakers. These will be addressed in the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Kindly note, the chat function will be deactivated following this introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your transcript. Please allow up to a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenters do not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. Now, I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers for today's session. Please welcome Marianne Armstrong, Chad Nelson, and Carla Pendacourt. Let's turn it over to you.
Thank you, Felix. I appreciate that, and very pleased to be with you all today. So thank you to everyone who's joined our Build Climate Smart, Preparing Canada's Built Environment for Climate Change webinar, as organized by the Ontario Association of Architects. The structure of today's talk will begin with myself offering some opening remarks, actually about up to slide 35 in this presentation. We're certainly looking forward to a lively discussion session at the end of today's presentation. Our three talks will run for 60, 75 minutes, and then we'll be really glad to entertain your questions. So following my opening remarks in the presentation, we'll then turn to our partners, the National Research Council and the Standards Council of Canada. Please do feel free to type your questions in the chat or unmute your mic at the end or during our question and answer period. I believe the chat is the primary focus. I will open the next slide here. Maybe I'll just mention, actually, there are QR codes on this front piece that will take you to websites, as well as a website link that can be useful afterwards. The presentation today, I'll begin with an overview of where we're journeying together in this presentation. I'll first of all confess it's a fairly text-heavy presentation, certainly for my part, because we see this as a reference opportunity of information-rich. Hopefully you'll find it as such. We'll be talking about climate change impacts internationally across Canada and the costs, the challenges they represent, to finding success and how the federal government is taking action. And there are three particular features of that we'll speak to: the National Adaptation Strategy, and then my colleagues Marianne and Carla will speak to the Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative and the Standards to Support Resilience Infrastructure Program, respectively. This will be followed at the end by a few slides to provide an overview on natural infrastructure, and again, a discussion. There's biographies for the three of us, actually, I understand, in the program material that was sent out. Maybe I'll just mention a quick word of intro for the colleagues that I have the pleasure of working with frequently. Starting with myself, I'm a principal advisor and manager at Infrastructure Canada, but now being renamed as we transition to the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. I work in the Adaptation and Resilience Division, where I have the pleasure since 2016 with this department of working on infrastructure climate resilience matters and of the longstanding collaboration with the NRC and the SCC. I came from Environment Canada, and I trained originally as a planner. I really enjoyed working with architects and engineers as well. Marianne Armstrong is the director of the National Research Council's Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative. And in this role, she has a key role in establishing and executing the National Research Program, again, which focuses on increasing the resilience of Canada's infrastructure and buildings to climate change and extreme events. And Kala Pendeker is the manager of the Climate Change and Sustainability team with the Standards Council of Canada. And in that role, she oversees the program that we'll be talking about today, which advances community infrastructure resilience through standards. With that, I'll just revisit our learning outcomes that were noted today for today's, and we'll be talking about really trying to provide you with a bit of a deeper understanding on the impacts of climate change, how that the interface of those with infrastructure. We'll talk about public policy approaches to deal with integrating climate resilience into buildings and infrastructure, and then as well speak to tools, resources, knowledge products that are really key in this domain, and again talk about natural infrastructure and the co-benefits that it provides. As for context setting, I'd like to now open a section of the talk which will talk about impacts, costs, and defining success. One of the graphs that I found really quite useful, NASA in the United States has put out many visualizations of where have we been traveling from in a sense of global warming, where are we going into the future. And this graphic speaks to sort of the last, well, more than a century, but since 1880, as to what have the changes in temperature been globally. Canada's featured here on the far left. There's a list of countries here, start the letter C over here. And as we come to an end in 2021, this red bar is actually Canada. As you go beyond 0 degrees to +1, this is the change in annual average temperature. And it has a lot of consequence for us in Canada. I'm going to do a little bit of a tricky thing and see if I can show you one more graph without losing my presentation. This is another visualization from NASA, even more recent information. And I'll speed it up. It's about anomalies over 5-year periods over the last century again. And you'll see where we end up with this short visualization. Again, is showing a significant amount of global warming, climate change in the north. And in fact, Canada is warming at double the global average and triple in our northern regions. So that means that, in fact, we have already warmed 1.7 degrees Celsius between 1948 and 2016. And the average winter temperature has warmed in Canada about 3.3 degrees Celsius for the same 60-year period. So we're looking at an average annual temperature increase projected by end of the century between 1.8 degrees Celsius and 6.3 degrees Celsius if emissions are not reduced. One of the ways I summarize this is that if you think about with really the period of time, a span of 150 years from 1950 to 2100, we could experience a comparable increase in the global temperature compared to what was experienced since the last period of major glaciation over 5,000 years ago. So it's a fairly rapid acceleration. And this is really critical to think about when we understand that 1/3 of Canada's infrastructure is due for upgrades and will require the right tools and data to withstand climate impacts. So as we move into more of an detail on what does this mean for Canada? Well, we've already been breaking a number of weather-related records. I think anybody seen the news lately would see just the continuing coverage about the increase in extreme weather events and along with kind of temperature averages. These have impacts on the long-term performance of buildings and infrastructure. I think this is where we get to the crucial interest for the architectural profession. And there are serious, significant costs economically when you're looking at premature repair, replacement of infrastructure, structures that fail to really live out the full services during their projected lifespan. So this means that there's a need to adapt to avoid and mitigate significant impacts on our health and safety and prosperity. And this, though our actions do need to be informed by local context and knowledge. And there are some visuals on this slide that speak to things that we've experienced in Canada over the last little while. And maybe I'll just mention a few things that were talked about in the 2019 report by Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. It said that in Canada, we'll have more extreme heat, less extreme cold, earlier spring peak stream flow, more thawing permafrost, and rising sea levels, with precipitation projected to increase for most of Canada and potentially some decrease in summer rainfall in some areas. And a warmer climate would intensify some weather extremes, but understand that extreme hot temperatures will become more frequent and more intense, increasing the severity of heat waves and drought and wildfire risks. So these findings were 2-3 years ago, and they also noted that coastal flooding is expected to increase. When we think about what's in the news, we think very much about wildfire and flooding and extreme heat being the face of sort of immediate climate impacts, but there's certainly a wide range of them that we'll talk about, such as sea level rise and permafrost thaw. I'll move to the next slide. This gives you a little bit more of a bit of a typology about the types of impacts we're seeing. And so it's really important to understand that these impacts vary in size and impact and other sort of unforeseen knock-on or cascading consequences. Certainly, we do see permafrost thaw, flooding, sea level rise, storm surges, and wildfires as common examples of what's happening, and that really severely disrupt the daily lives of residents in Canada, including causing infrastructure failure and disrupting energy and communication, as well as transportation infrastructure. So quite an opportunity, one would say, in a crisis to do things differently going forward. One of the important points to think about in this context is the differential impacts that are experienced in terms of seeing climate as a threat multiplier that amplifies existing sort of social vulnerability and thereby contributes to disparity that already exists. And this slide speaks to sort of the uneven burdens and disproportionate impacts. I certainly found it striking when I was reading that First Nations communities are on reserve are 18 times more likely to be evacuated due to climate-related disasters than people living off reserve. And certainly we know about some populations having differential vulnerability. If you look at the over 600 people who died prematurely during the heat wave in British Columbia in 2021, there were certainly discernible subsets of the population, whether people are seniors or isolated or have pre-existing health conditions. And the solutions are also not experienced the same way. So important things to be thinking about as we try to unpack what is the challenge that we need to collectively confront. And it's also valuable, we're constantly asked inside Infrastructure Canada to speak to the economic aspects of this. And so it's very helpful to be able to explain that there's been quite a significant increase in the economic costs related to climate impacts. And so in fact, I think I've made the text perhaps too large on the right-hand side here, but between 2010 and 2019, the annual average number of events jumped to 11, and it really reflected nearly a doubling of the costs of previous 3 decades combined of disasters, weather-related disasters. And there's some examples here in very large font, which is helpful for my eyes to give you a quick overview of just sort of up to 2021, many of the key impacts that we saw in Canada, whether they were things such as the Fort McMurray, where entire towns suffered extreme fire damage, and more recently, Lytton, BC, has become the face of such discussions about wildfire. But then we also had those storms out east and really across the country in extreme heat. So it's pretty widespread in terms of the nature of the challenges in front of us. What I'd like to get to on this slide is to speak to sort of those structures. If you compare assets to hazards, that's one of the things we're continually looking to do, especially as we apply a climate lens to our funding programs. So it's very helpful to see how, from this table, how certain climate change impacts can severely impact daily essential services and assets. And for example, a combination of ice storms and wet snow can have a high risk of causing power line and transmission structure failure. Some of us will remember the Montreal ice storm of 1998. But similarly, intense and accumulated rainfall can cause failure in stormwater and wastewater infrastructure. And think about the community of Merritt in 2021 that was evacuated when the floods, the atmospheric rivers happened in BC and the wastewater infrastructure failed in Merritt, BC. So a wide array of interactions here. And maybe one of the interesting points to make as well is that there sometimes are, to some degree, tipping points. Like I've seen presentations on extreme wind where when you go from like 90%, a value of 90 to 100, the actual impacts almost double in terms of the failure. And maybe I can unpack that later in a bit of a discussion. Certainly we see that there's a better recognition over time of the need to take action and understanding what's happening. This 2019 report by the Council of Canadian Academies was quite instrumental in that it ranked infrastructure as one of the top domains of most consequential where climate impacts would affect Canadian society. But it also said that the domain of public infrastructure was the one that they found where we could actually have make the most difference in reducing the adverse impacts of climate change. Some things like impacts on fishery stocks are harder to influence. So again, over the recent years, we've seen quite a bit of action in terms of more public dialogue, and whether that's research reports on the cost of climate change coming out from the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario most recently, but also the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and Insurance Bureau of Canada, speaking to the $5 billion that could be invested annually by municipalities to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But we've also seen municipalities pass climate emergency declarations, and globally seen a recurring in annual reports from the World Economic Forum about climate issues. As we look to define success in tackling these challenges, it's helpful for me, I find, to think about these really has sort of three or more key elements. It's about making location decisions regarding public infrastructure, but it's also about the planning, the design, and building of infrastructure, but also about its planned operation and maintenance, those schedules, so that we sustain the assets and the flow of services from them. It also is important that it withstand and respond to and recover rapidly from disruptions. On the right-hand side is actually a bit of a visual from Honduras of a Choluteca River, where I understand actually architects were involved in designing a hugely sophisticated and sort of hurricane and high wind-proof bridge. But what happened after Hurricane Mitch is that the river relocated itself, and the bridge is no longer, which was a vital one to connect roads, but it was no longer essentially in the right place. And so to me, this is an interesting story about the need for systems thinking, and thinking kind of very broadly. And I think that's something that architects yourselves have a vital role in society to play. This is a graphic that in further definition of climate resilience that I find quite helpful. I'm thankful to the Canadian Standards Association for providing it. It really states that we're talking about resistance, redundancy, responsiveness, reliability, and whether that is, in this illustration, responsive in terms of flood planning and preparation. This is a sort of an example about sort of water management, use of natural infrastructure, building, use of protecting built and natural assets from hazards, but having also spare capacity. So when you think about when there's intense rainfalls and stressing the capacity of our wastewater treatment systems. How do we have enough spare capacity to deal with these things? But ultimately, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office has a useful definition about resilience as the ability of a system or community or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. Sounds like high goals, but helpful in framing things. And why are we just seeking to pursue climate resilience so actively in the public domain? Well, there's certainly an array of important benefits. These are actually important for helping to inform how we define the natural infrastructure fund. But when you pursue resilient infrastructure, you can see mitigating the loss of life, whether that's having sort of cooling stations during a heat wave, natural infrastructure to lower the urban heat island impacts, or others. So loss of life can be avoided. You can enhance the performance of your infrastructure, essentially by extending the lifespan of the services, reduce the total cost of asset ownership, support economic growth, lower our carbon footprints when done well, and support quality of life. Federally, we've been taking a fair bit of action in terms of knowledge and capacity building, and this is at the forefront, our collaboration with the National Research Council and the Standards Council of Canada that was actually just mentioned about 20 minutes ago in the Parliamentary Standing Committee was following on transportation, infrastructure, and communities by our minister and our deputy minister, the importance of this work to build knowledge capacity. And actually, the profession of architects was mentioned during that standing committee just now, of the importance for climate resilience. We've also been working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on different programs to support municipal action. But we also have at Infrastructure Canada, or we really should be saying Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities Canada, direct cost-shared public infrastructure funding programs. So some of our programs look at what is the population of your province, and we allocate funds accordingly to support public infrastructure investments in partnership. We also have merit-based programs, such as our Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And we also have transfers, such as the Canada Community Building Fund, that really historically was called the gas tax, but has evolved since then. We've also been involved in assessments and strategies. I'll talk a little bit more about the National Assessment Strategy in just a moment. So I'll just mention here, we have a National Infrastructure Assessment process underway. We have an ongoing federally and national risk profiling efforts to really understand what are the risks and the challenges for our capabilities arising from flood, fire, and earthquake and others. Also, we have in place a greening government strategy to get our own house in order, as well as applying a federal climate lens to our funding. Other things that we've been doing over the last few years that our department have been investing in an array of programs. And so these speak to really a wide number of programs that have tried to factor in climate resilience, whether that's through having a climate lens applied. And we're actually up to $2.4 billion for 92 projects committed or announced under our Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. We've also launched, a Natural Infrastructure Fund. Many of these intakes are now closed, and we're looking to see where to from here. And we'll stay tuned as a society. One of the most important things that we've been involved in over the last couple of years was the development of Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, the first ever for Canada. And it really presents a whole of society direction for a more resilient Canada. It attempts to better align and coordinate our efforts by different orders of government, Indigenous peoples, the private sector, civil society, and really offer a touchstone framework for moving ahead collectively. Then the overarching vision is here on the screen for how do we pursue resilience in Canada? What does that mean? And seeing how our collective adaptation actions can enhance our well-being and safety, promote justice, equity, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and secure a thriving natural environment and economy for future generations. We have guiding principles in this, and infrastructure was one of 5 core pillars where we had transformational goals, objectives, and targets. And that was really very significant in getting an opportunity to interact with experts from across the country to define, and public engagement as well through this whole process, to really define this section, this pillar that I think is most of interest potentially to architects. But all infrastructure systems, as a 2050 transformational goal in Canada, will be climate resilient and undergo continuous adaptation to adjust for future impacts to deliver reliable, equitable, and sustainable services to all society. There are objectives that are sort of technical, of policy nature, as well as socioeconomic and financial, that are sort of high level. But I'd like to skip ahead to the next slide that had very specific targets. And the recent reports in the UK have said that Canada was at the front of the pack in terms of having very specific targets nationally on adaptation. And so what we've talked about here in areas I think are relevant to architects is that by 2026, additional climate change resiliency considerations are incorporated into 3 Canadian codes, robust guidance, codes, and standards covering top climate change risks for key public infrastructure systems are available to be adopted by all infrastructure decision makers. And we also talked about the fact that starting this year in 2024, resilience to climate change impacts is factored into all new federal infrastructure funding programs. That's something that's keeping our team quite busy in our world. I'd like to touch on, as we're wrapping up the discussion on the National Adaptation Strategy, areas that really speak to goals and short-term outcomes that are relevant to the architects. And I think we speak here to climate competent professionals, and that was actually the focus of a question just now in the Parliamentary Standing Committee. How do we ensure that everybody has the skills that are needed as we seek to advance kind of a broader integration of considerations? How do we advance asset management to account better for climate change and ensure that we have access to very helpful knowledge products to define performance and success of infrastructure in an altered climate? It also speaks to the need to support public and private investment and using requirements or criteria in how we make our key decisions. So we are very busy in looking at how do we encourage climate risk assessments by developing a scalable approach in Infrastructure Canada. Moving ahead, I'm going to come close to wrapping up my time here by speaking to something that I find very useful when you are communicating to other people about what this means, because many of us in Canada have enjoyed gardening at one time or another, and we often think about frost-free zones. And what has been really great to see that our colleagues at Environment Climate Change Canada and the Canadian Centre for Climate Services have recently released is our new building zones, climate zones across Canada. For me, it's an interesting parallel to when we think a little bit about the world of gardening. So what we're seeing is a change in these building climate zones to understand our projections of what will be future climate design values. And those future climate design values have been funded, the creation of them, through the work of the NRC. And so there's just so much value to be gained by communicating to people how do we take positive action in it for an altered future. I'd like to speak a little bit about the federal initiatives and opportunities that have kind of emerged since and from the National Adaptation Strategy. They set the foundation for a further engagement that's underway right now with the National Research Council and the Standards Council of Canada. There's a lot of text on the slides. I'm going to take a little sip of water. We'll maybe have a chance to take a little look at it. Coffee, if I do confess. And what's important here is probably 2 things. We've been thinking about a value chain as a way to frame our work on infrastructure and resilience. So how do we take knowledge, sort of science, I just mentioned future climate design values, because we know those are so important to architects and engineers as you design assets to endure with long lifespans. How do we have access to such fundamental data and design values? How can that best inform guidance, be those construction specifications or best practices? And then how can those be also codified in tools? So meaning guidelines, standards, proposed updates to national codes. And then how can we support uptake and use? Meaning we need to see support for capacity, use of requirements and criteria. And so there's sort of a value chain has been a helpful way for us to think about this. And in fact, it aligns with some of the things that have resulted from the National Adaptation Strategy. So first of all, we received support, almost 60 million, like 59.6 million over 5 years was announced as an advent to the National Adaptation Strategy that I should say was released in June 2023. This new funding came to NRCs, we speak in acronyms in the federal government, the National Research Council of Canada, the Standards Council of Canada, as well as our department. And that is to support continued work to prioritize and conduct the foundational research, develop and update new guidance, and translate this into usable tools. And all this is about accelerating adoption. And so one of the interesting things I think would be primarily of key interest to architects is that we are taking the future climate design values and with colleagues over at Environment Climate Change Canada, creating project specification sheets in partnership with climatedata.ca that can be useful for over 680 sites across the country to understand how do we build for a future that's different from the past. We've also put out a new web page at our department that was part of the QR code on the front that gives you an overview of the wonderful, rich, informative products that the NRC and the SCC have been creating. Resilience requirements is a second element that's emerged since the National Adaptation Strategy, with a commitment publicly that, as I said, starting 2024, meaning this year, we will be applying resilience requirements in our funding programs. And that means you need a scalable approach if it's a small project, or a more involved risk assessment and risk treatment if it's a larger project. But how do we know that we're getting kind of that value, that assurance about the services of an asset enduring in a rapidly changing climate? We also received support, just a little under 100 million over 5 years, to support open access climate toolkits online with tools, data, learning resources. And this means also support from a new help desk and a roster of practitioners. So that work is proceeding and also led by Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. We also received a top-up of 489 million of additional funding for our Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. And in digging in a little bit and setting the ground for Marianne and Calla to speak, when we look at what have we been doing on guidance, and we use that broadly from data to best practices to guidelines to standards to code updates, well, there's been a significant spending of over 160 million collectively since 2016 to create these new knowledge products. And that's meant things such as 65 climate-informed code standards, guidance, and tools. And again, the future climate design data, for 680 locations across the country. Priority areas going forward, and this will be spoken about by my colleagues, but I'll give a quick glance to sort of perhaps what your thirst to know more about them: natural infrastructure, flooding, extreme heat, wildland-urban interface design, transit, northern regions, and integrated risk management. So we know that there are many benefits to taking action, to having new guidance available, and we have some economic assessments. I think this may be spoken to a little bit more as well after me, is that we've seen really significant potential benefits from using things such as the National Wildland Urban Interface or Wildfire Guideline, a new best practice checklist that's just come out from that, and we're looking to create new standards. And this means that the spending on this to align with these practices could be cost 150 million, but save 900 million. And the widespread implementation of the national guidelines on the flood resistance of buildings could have an 11-to-1 benefit ratio. So as I said, we're here to hear a little bit more from the people who do all the important work of the research and the overseeing the creation of new standards. And this work continues. So as I look to try to start wrapping things up in my section here, I'll just say that standards are a core focus for our work, as they really reflect an accepted bar for practice that can be reflected in regulations and can be updated on a regular cycle, and really, and when used properly, can help keep Canadians safe and our communities more resilient and lower those total costs of asset ownership. There's a wide variety of guidance documents which you can access through the information here and that we've referenced in this presentation for you, and so much more to be shared. Our website at Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada speaks again to the many pieces that have resulted from the hard work of the NRC and the SCC, such as these ones on a variety of assets, starting in preceding, I should say, on hazards, whether it's flood, fire, heat, snow, wind, and again on assets such as buildings at the community scale as well, along with water, stormwater, wastewater, and bridges. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Marianne. Hope that came across well.
Great. Thanks so much, Chad. I mean, it really sets the stage for why the work we're doing on codes and standards and research is so important as we aim to move the bar forward. So this is my title slide, and I'm going to point to the QR code. That's the same QR code that you saw earlier, so you might not need to take a new picture of it. But it is a great link to find out more about all the research that's ongoing, including a lot of the documents that are now available. I would also point to the one for Infrastructure Canada that brings together really all those codes and standards that are now available, is also a wonderful link to check out. Next, please. So we've been working with Infrastructure Canada since 2016. It's been a really wonderful relationship with them to be able to undertake the research to move the bar forward on resilience in Canada. This was all thanks to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change at the time, and most recently under the National Adaptation Strategy as we're aiming and seeking to support. So our latest initiative is a Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative, which started in 2021. So we're just rounding out what we call year 3 of that one. But we also recently received additional funding to keep going and accelerate and expand our scope with the Government of Canada Adaptation Action Plan. So in this part of the presentation, I'll point to some of the deliverables under our first initiative, but also some of these new areas that we're now working in. Next, please. So what does the NRC do? Well, the NRC is a team of researchers across multiple disciplines. We have over 100 different researchers working at least part-time on adaptation and climate resilience from across different research centers, including our Construction Research Center, our Aerospace Research Center, our Oceans, Coastal, and River Research Center, as well as our Surface Transport. So there is a lot of expertise and a lot of work ongoing. So what is NRC good at? NRC is good at figuring out what's going on, trying to understand how the climate is changing and what we can do about it for our infrastructure assets. Now, what we're less good at is getting the word out and getting the information used. And that's where partnerships with Infrastructure Canada and others become so important. So as we move from what NRC does in that central bubble there outwards, we see the importance of the partners as we work with the provinces and territories on national codes, as we help underpin procurement requirements, including resilience requirements for investment with the federal government, as we seek to provide the best information for which technologies are most appropriate for retrofit programs, get information out through portals, work with SCC to move guidance through to standardization, and others as we move to demonstrate through pilot studies. So that's the next step forward, and those are the people we're directly working with. But if we want to enable change, and as I say, create a culture of resilience in Canada where we're thinking about it from day one, from education in schools through to all the decision making that takes place in construction projects over the lifespan of the project, then we need to be ensuring that this information reaches professionals such as architects, engineers, and is part of education courses, part of regulation, requirements, and decision-making tools. And that's really what this larger bubble is about. At the end of the day, I don't want to be without a job, but research is just the start of this long chain. And we want to make sure that everyone has the information they need to be able to adapt. Another important part of the slide is to understand the key drivers behind adaptation. So why do we need to adapt? Chad pointed to avoiding financial loss, a lot of insured losses, a lot of uninsured losses that we forget about, and a lot of impacts that aren't reflected in those dollar signs, but certainly financial loss is a big driver for the need to take action. Avoiding health consequences as well. We want to make sure that our houses, our buildings remain healthy, safe environments for everyone in a changing climate. And then Chad pointed to as well the importance of equitable adaptation. People such as myself, I'm not terribly worried. I can afford to adapt. So I have a good house. It's not going to be difficult for me to survive in a changing climate. But what we need to remember is that there are very vulnerable populations in Canada. There are people who can't afford to adapt and are likely at higher risk from flooding, from heat waves and other situations. And those are the people we need to keep in mind to bring along with us as the country adapts. Next, please. So at NRC, we've been conducting research in a number of different areas, including extreme events such as wildfire, flooding, extreme heat, extreme wind, but also some of the slower impacts of climate change, like permafrost melt, durability, impacts of freeze-thaw cycles on pavement, for example, or increased corrosion due to increase in temperatures. So we're working to understand how Canada is changing climate and what solutions we can bring to the table. And this can include things such as nature-based solutions. So what is the role of nature in helping us adapt? Next, please. So Chad pointed to a few of the results from our work. I brought with me today just this one slide that summarizes a lot of the building related outputs, which I thought might be interesting to share. The first one is the future climate design data, which we work closely with engineers. We work closely with climate scientists, the Pacific Climate Impact Consortium, Environment Canada, to develop data that's suitable for the design of buildings, bridges, and infrastructure. And we're really excited that this data is available through the PCIC Design Value Explorer, but it's also now informing the building code and the bridge code. For the bridge code, I think we're past public review and we expect the future data to be included in the next version. For buildings, the public review is likely to come out in the next round, so keep an eye out for that. And ultimately, from my understanding, we're going to be the very first country to be designing for future climates and not for historic data once those codes become available. So that's very exciting news and really the fruition of a lot of hard work to get there. Other guidance documents that we've developed and are available, there's guidance on overheating. There is work on durability as well with the CSA S478 standard, which we converted from a guideline to a standard, and now we're working to better reflect the future climate data in that work as well. Other ones, low slope roofing membranes, there's climate resilience standard available there. The WUI guide, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, as well as a suite of guidance documents related to flooding, including the CSA Z800 guideline on basement flood protection. I've thrown in a couple on the end there because I like to keep it a little bit more complete, including wind and permafrost, but those are really SCC outputs. So I'll let Kala cover those in a minute. Next, please. So now I wanted to highlight a few of the research areas that we're working on. We have over 60 different projects ongoing. We have upwards of 150 to 200 different partners on board. I'm not going to cover all of those today, but hopefully I can mention a few of the really interesting areas that we're currently working on. One, of course, is extreme heat. I believe we're all aware that a few summers ago, there was a heat dome in BC and over 600 people lost their lives prematurely during that heat wave. And the biggest takeaway for us in the building sector was the majority of those people lost their lives indoors in their own homes. And so that's a huge takeaway for us. It tells us that there's a problem, and it's a problem that we need to be looking at and solving and doing what we can to protect the lives of Canadians. So we've been working on overheating both at the building level and at the community level. We've been looking at understanding how the human body is impacted by heat. Different people are affected differently. The elderly, people who are not as healthy as others, such as people who have diabetes, as well as children, have a different response to heat than healthy adults. So we're factoring that into the work we're doing. And we're trying to understand not only what creates a safe environment indoors, but how do we keep that environment below a safe temperature during heat waves. So we've been modeling different types of buildings, including some of the archetypes shown here, long-term care, residential buildings, to understand what measures we can take, be it passive measures such as shading, natural ventilation, or more active measures, including mechanical ventilation and air conditioning. And in some cases, in existing buildings with people who are high risk, air conditioning currently might be the only solution. And we need to point that out. But in new buildings that we can design to be more climate resilient, there's more opportunities. We also have pilot studies right now in multi-unit residential buildings to understand what climates people are currently exposed to and the effectiveness of different retrofit measures. We're looking at both overheating in those cases as well as prevention of wildfire smoke. And that's an interesting intersection in that if I don't have air conditioning in my building and there is a wildfire event and it's very warm out, I'm not in a situation to be able to open my windows because I don't want the smoke in. So it's one of those occasions where we need to be looking at some of those events happening at the same time to help inform better design. Next, please. So the building itself is one area we can look at, but to properly tackle extreme heat, we also have to look at urban heat islanding. So the researchers in this case have been modeling different city centers, including Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, to look at how future climates and heat waves will affect urban heat islanding, and also looking at what solutions we can bring, including looking at green roofs, water bodies, increased greenery, increased green canopy, as well as the use of cool materials, which actually have quite a good promise, including cool roofs to help reduce urban heat islanding. So we're looking at how can we combine urban heat islanding solutions with building level solutions to create the coolest areas we can in our cities and ensure health and safe Canadians. Next, please. On the wildfire side, Chad mentioned our Wildland Urban Interface Design Guide. So we worked with a committee of experts from across the country, from different walks of life, including people who worked on FireSmart. We had firefighters, we had home builders, we had climate experts, forestry experts, who helped develop the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires. So this guide is informing, now there's a checklist available in BC to make it easier for people to see what measures they can take to prevent wildfire spread. So that's informing that. It's also informing Build Back Better programs for Lytton. So a lot of really valuable information there. And we recently partnered with the Standards Council of Canada to move this forward to 2 standards. So one of them is actually going to look at community level measures, and the second one at the building level measures. So we hope to start developing that standard this year based on the results from a few workshops that we ran this past year, or well, 2022 is 2022. We're getting there. So this year we do hope we're going to be, or we do plan to develop the standard starting this year. Thank you. Next. As Chad pointed out, if we apply standards like the WUI guideline across the country, we will see benefits. So we had an assessment undertaken by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction to better understand the cost of applying the wildland urban interface design guideline across the country, as well as the benefit. So in cases where there is a high hazard, the benefit to cost ratio was 14:1, so very large. Nationally, across the country, if applied right across the board, it was 4:1. And we'll see this in many cases when we look at resilience measures, it's 4:1 and up generally. And what's not reflected in that, we're also creating jobs, saving lives, avoiding injuries, and everyone loves taxes. This was funny, increasing tax revenue by $1 billion, but overall benefits to the country by undertaking resilience measures. Next, please. So I'm going to end with 3 new areas to us. So with the new funding with the National Adaptation Strategy, we have the opportunity to accelerate the work we're doing, but also expand into new areas and address new gaps. One of these is to work with the Canadian Construction Materials Center to be able to evaluate resilient materials and systems. So the CCMC right now, they evaluate novel new materials and systems for climate or for codes. So they look at what's the code minimum, does this product meet the code minimum, and they give it a stamp of approval. So what we're looking to do is work with them to go above and beyond what's in the codes to say, I have a new material, say a new siding product, it's going to perform in high hazard fire situations and be able to say, yes, check mark, it does perform as expected and can be used in those situations. So we're looking to do this for wildfire, flooding, durability, high wind, for example, really to create a database of products that are suitable for increasing the resilience of our buildings. So really interesting work underway there. We're hoping to have a number of products evaluated by 2028. Next, please. Another area we're always working on code. So I mentioned the climate data. We've also had work on preventing overheating that's informing the codes, this code cycle. We're also with the code system discussing what are the policy implications really of addressing wildfire, flooding, high wind in the codes, and that's expected to inform action for 2030. Now, in parallel to that, we've also launched some new projects. We're working with Western University on extreme wind, including tornadoes. So we're looking to provide recommendations to the code system on how to address tornadoes, as well as developing design guidance for existing houses to be more resilient to high wind. And then also we are working as well on wildfire smoke and indoor air quality and looking to provide the information and guidance to inform the committees of the code system. Next, please. And my last slide, I want to mention flood barriers. This area really excites me. Working with the Ocean and Coastal River Engineering Group, we now have the capability at the NRC and the capacity to evaluate flood barriers here in Ottawa, actually, at our facility. We're one of 2 facilities in North America with that capability to assess them. We're looking to work with industry to evaluate barriers like the one shown here, but also barriers that are integrated into buildings, such as the type of barrier you see in a doorway or a garage door or a window. So looking to ensure that we have technologies available to help keep Canadians safe from flooding, especially in the conditions we see in Canada, which can include things such as ice. So with that, I will end my presentation on research and pass it over to Kala to speak about standards.
Hi, thanks so much, Marianne, and thank you very much for having me here today. As mentioned, my name is Kala, and I lead the SCC Standards to Support Resilience and Infrastructure program. Apologies, I'm fighting through a bit of a cold today, so my voice may crack here and there. But before I really dive into the program itself, I want to take a quick step back to go over what we mean by standards and how these differ from other guidance and from tools like codes. So when I talk about a standard, what I'm talking about in our context are national standards of Canada, as well as standards that are developed through international systems like ISO. And those are standards that go through accredited processes, which have very unique and transparent pieces around them. And at their core, standards are documents that they establish accepted practices, technical requirements, and terminologies for diverse fields. And we have standards for numerous subjects. You know, there are national standards of Canada that deal with buildings, electrical standards, healthcare standards, the list goes on and on. And by default, these standards are voluntary unless they're referenced in a regulation or a code. But I would say that these standards, or national standards of Canada in particular, they're so ingrained in our lives that most of the time we really don't think about them. When you walk into a room and you flip on a light switch, I would guess, or I would hope that very few of us here are worried about an electrical fire. And that's because we trust in the system that's in place and the requirements behind how our electrical systems are wired. And standards and the electrical code are really to thank for that. So, you know, how do we, at a high level, how do we distinguish between standards, guidance, and codes? From where I'm speaking from, guidance documents in our world really tend to highlight best practices, where in comparison, standards will include terminology on what's required to meet a standard. And codes, they tend to be much broader than standards and often reference a large number of standards themselves. So the National Building Code of Canada, for instance, references over 400 standards. So you can really think of a standard as a recipe, whereas a code would be the recipe book. Next slide, please. So as I think Chad really did a fantastic job demonstrating, climate change is impacting our communities from all angles. From coast to coast to coast, we're experiencing the effects of things like sea level rise, heat waves, wildfires, and intensified storms. And we are all seeing these incidents increase each year, and they do disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. So it is, I say, essential to transition towards sustainable and resilient practices that mitigate further challenges, environmental degradation, and also work on enhancing our community resilience. And to address all these issues, a major shift is required within our market, our regulatory, and our policy frameworks. And this is where standards can come in and help us to scale action across sectors and communities. Standards are also how we can transition from voluntary action to accepted activities to mandatory practice once they're referenced in things like the National Building Code or through regulation. So that's why we at the Standards Council of Canada have been working with our partners in government and industry alongside standards development organizations and with communities across the country to create standards that really help us mitigate the effect we are seeing from climate change. And I will say, you know, in general, standards and conformity assessment can be applied to the built environment because they provide that framework for consistency, quality, and best practices across industries and sectors. And there really is quite a significant need to update our building standards to a changing climate. Until quite recently, building standards assumed static climate. But as we know, as the climate changes, older standards are no longer keeping up. So our program, amongst many efforts, is in place to help expedite the update of existing standards, as well as to make sure that new standards are available to help address concerns like wildland-urban interface fires that were not as much of a concern as they are today. Standards really can mainstream, advance, and professionalize the field of climate change adaptation by codifying those key principles and practices. And because they are built by consensus with a balance of stakeholders, they also reflect a variety of voices and perspectives. So they ensure broad applicability and usefulness, I would say. And under the NAS, we've been working with infrastructure and with NRC, and our aim is to advance 86 standards and related technical guidance across several key subject areas, all with the goal of making sure that those technical standards have been updated or developed to embed climate change in all decisions, from location to planning to design to managing, adapting, operating, and all through the way to maintaining infrastructure systems across their life cycles. So these standards that we're supporting, we're, I'd say, about halfway through a number of them, but we're ensuring that what gaps there are being filled through the program and through our work with NRC and INFC. And I mentioned we have a few different streams. They're here on the board. So we're operating in areas of northern climate resilience. We have I'm going to say catch-all around strengthening assets against extreme weather conditions. We're looking at how you can integrate risk management into your planning. We have a whole stream of work, which is very exciting, around nature-based solutions. And then we're starting to explore how we can support both low carbon resilient building materials as well as climate resilient transportation infrastructure. So what does this mean for you? We've been working in the climate and infrastructure standardization space for about a decade now, and we have a pretty solid grasp of what's available to support your climate infrastructure standardization needs. So if you need a hand to navigate standards in the standardization system, please don't be shy to reach out. Or if you feel like there's a lack of guidance in a particular area, you know, we're always open to you letting us know, so we can see if one, we can find if that gap's been filled by a particular standard, or two, we could help support the development of a standard in that area moving forward. So on the screen, I highlighted our 6 themes, but I'll expand on those and give you a couple of examples so you can understand what's within our sandbox and where we can help. So if you don't mind just going to the next slide, please. Thank you. So our northern specific work in this area, I would say we were really working by the north and for the north. We've supported a huge number, I think about a dozen or a dozen and a half standards that deal directly with changing permafrost conditions. So these are things like how to manage changing permafrost thaw, how to design and implement thermosiphons, as well as how to deal with more extreme conditions in the north, like high winds and changing snow loads. In the short term and in the near future, we're looking at how we can address community roadway management and how to support the reduction of mold in buildings. Next slide, please. Sorry, from a southern perspective, first and foremost, we're looking at how to de-risk community infrastructure from extreme weather events. So some of the areas we are continuing to look at, I'll say, are flood mitigation, urban heat island assessment and mitigation, and storm protection for utilities. We also have an existing arsenal of work in this area dealing with high winds and flooding. So for instance, our existing flooding work touches on community design to reduce flooding risks, as well as specific guidance on reducing challenges of inflow and infiltration. And I think Marianne touched on it very briefly around emergency flood barriers, but we have partnered with the NRC to support the development of a municipal flood guide, which will tell municipalities when and where to implement certain emergency flood barriers. So how you choose them, how you operate them, and what might be the challenges in doing so. But we're also tackling less visible impacts like urban heat, because we know that cities are especially vulnerable to higher temperatures, and higher population density and less green space can lead to up to a 15-degree temperature difference between cities and surrounding areas. And with 3 in 4 Canadians living in cities, the urban heat island effect really does pose quite a risk to many. So one tool that we're working on is providing communities with a way to understand where their urban heat island zones might be most at risks. So at the moment, there are quite a few different methodologies for mapping urban heat. We've partnered with Health Canada to standardize those urban heat island mapping techniques so that communities can better identify which areas need the most attention. Next slide, please. From integrating risk management, so you know, we know on our end that as many of you do, that more resilient buildings start with needing to understand what the risks and vulnerabilities are for those buildings. So we have a whole theme of work around risk management. And our starting point for this is looking at how we can adopt 2 international standards on vulnerability and risk assessment into the Canadian context. So these are ISO 1490 on adaptation to climate change, around principles, requirements, and guidance, and then ISO 1491 on guidelines around vulnerability, impacts, and risk assessments. So these two international standards are quite well utilized, and what we're doing is we're bringing them into the Canadian context so that information relevant for Canadian communities and users will be embedded in it. So that will be things like where to go to find trusted Canadian climate data, and what climate risks might be most relevant for your community based on your geographic location. So very happy to say that this work is already launched, and we're expecting the adoptions of these standards to be available within the next 16 months. At the same time, we're also supporting two, I'm going to call implementation guides around those standards. So there will be a guide that will be directly applicable to asset management. So how do you apply ISO 1490 and 1491 to asset management? And then one around climate resilient transportation infrastructure. So how do you apply both of these to things like roadways? Next slide, please. Thank you. So the last three, I will say, themes I'll touch on very briefly because we're still exploring them and seeing where we can most provide impact. But we are looking at low carbon resilient building materials and climate resilient transportation, as well as nature-based solutions, although it's not pictured here. Within low carbon resilient building materials, as a starting point, we are supporting the development of a methodology to assess the trade-offs between low carbon versus resiliency in material designs, because we know that something that may be more resilient might have a higher carbon cost. So we're looking at a methodology to say, what are those trade-offs over the long term, especially in the case where a more resilient, perhaps higher carbon material is less needed to be repaired, retrofitted, or redone entirely. Within our climate resilient transportation infrastructure stream, we're starting by looking at how to mitigate flooding and coastal erosion adaptation for roads. And within our nature-based solutions, we're looking at how can we standardize green and natural infrastructure to help communities adapt. We are really scoping out this work at the moment. So if you have any ideas or knowledge in this area, we encourage you to reach out to us. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I spent quite a bit of time at the front selling you on standards, but we recognize that there are a growing number of tools and guidance available, and it can be quite a challenge to understand what is available, when it's most applicable, and why you may want to implement something that goes beyond past requirements or existing requirements. And I would say INFC has done a really wonderful job of collecting a number of these different tools and making them available. And I know the links are in this project, or in this PowerPoint deck. But if you go there, you can see by hazard what you may want to consider for implementation. We're also trying to help communities move past these barriers and understand what's available and why you might apply something. So wherever possible, we're developing plain language guidance and trying to bring in cost-benefit assessments so that you can see the value of going beyond the minimum or requirements or in an area. So by way of example, apologies. So by way of example, CSA 520 was published by CSA Group recently with funding from our program. And the standard is actually built off a SRIP-funded best practice guide of similar content on high wind safety. And the standard itself, it contains best practice guidance and requirements for the design and construction of low-rise wood frame buildings to withstand high winds, corresponding to, and I have to read this one because I always get it wrong, EF2 tornadoes, or EF2 tornado level wind speeds. So it was written to supplement the requirements specified in Part 9 of the National Building Code. And it's now being considered for inclusion in the next edition of the National Building Code as well. So we supported a cost-benefit analysis for the standard, and initial estimates suggest that the average benefit cost ratio is 6:1. So features from the standard are estimated to add about 1% to the construction cost to a two-story, 2,200 square foot house. So about $3,600 overall in costs adding on to the construction of a house. But the potential savings are estimated to avoid up to $22,000 in future losses if a tornado were to come through the area. So the additional costs are quite minimal on an overall construction scale, and the potential savings are very significant. And maybe before I hand it back over to Chad, I'll just say that, you know, implementing climate-informed standards and guidance really does help us to build resilience over the long term. We've gone through a number of different tools that are available and can be implemented now. And I do encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions, as these tools were developed to strengthen communities and reduce costs. Over to you, Chad.
Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate, and thank you, Marianne. It's just terrific working with both of you. I have an opportunity now to speak for a few quick slides about natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions. We wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of this increasingly emergent area that is quite promising and quite of interest, both from the practitioner perspective and also from sort of a policy perspective, particularly because of the co-benefits angle. So there's a few slides here that I'll just sort of speak to informally that talk about what is natural infrastructure, and really it can be the use of preserved, restored, or enhanced ecosystem features and services. And when you think about it, we do think about green roofs. You think about Toronto's had a bylaw in force around green roofs for a long time now. But it can also be the bioswales, as well as living dikes or constructed wetlands. And what's interesting when we think about it in the framework of natural infrastructure, which is in many ways we also call it sort of green-gray hybrid infrastructure too. But that's delivering a service for communities, for folks, but it also is delivering a range of co-benefits at the same time. And those are kind of brought out in the next few slides. The graphic is useful here on the right-hand side to take a little look at to get more of an intuitive sense. It speaks in green to some of those co-benefits, and speaks in sort of the black text to what is the action, such as the porous pavement or the rain gardens or that urban tree cover. We were just hearing about the urban heat island effect. We know these approaches can be consequential, along with other ones, such as the high reflectivity roofs and such. So we know that these services are important to be considered more than we have done in the past. And in general, the bottom bullet here is useful, where it speaks about when appropriately valued, measured, restored, constructed, they can really, and maintained, they offer a really valuable synergy between community services and benefits that flow from protecting, maintaining, and restoring ecosystems along with physical and mental health. Other ways to think a little bit about this are that it can happen in different scales. So, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature program is very significant. And so I've put a quote at the top from them here, but it's being the intentional alignment of natural and engineering processes to efficiently and sustainably deliver economic, environmental, and social benefits through collaboration. But these can be used at a watershed scale in Infrastructure Canada, or Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. And we have a great story in Surrey where our Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund has supported a living dike, more of a naturalized approach to protecting the communities from sea level rise. So it can happen at a watershed scale, at a neighborhood or site scale, and coastal areas as well can be particularly a good opportunity to use these these approaches to be considered. We've seen globally a lot of interest. In fact, Canada had a commissioner on the Global Commission on Adaptation, in Canada led the theme of nature-based solutions. This is back circa 2020, 2021, but we've seen a number of key entities moving in this domain, including the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, putting out a global standard on the use of nature-based solutions. So nationally, many times we've mentioned this is a federal priority, and I'll speak to this in the subsequent slide about our Natural Infrastructure Fund. And again, the key domains are cited here about coastal and riverine flood management, along with stormwater and extreme heat mitigation. There are constraints on using nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure that are things to be tackled, and there can be perception that returns would be low and high initial costs. There can be sometimes just an aversion to who wants to experiment with the level of service treatment of potable water. If you want to experimenting with municipal dollars that are finite, can be tricky. So we want to define, takes that sense of experimentation out as we move from sort of pilot studies to more established understandings and methodology where there's proven value in what context. They can also require a sense of working across silos, with whether it's the Parks Department and a Water Services Department and others. And they also really involve multi-solving, and the sort of many co-benefits can result, but is there enough value in any single benefit to support them being approved? So it's a rich area of discussion. One of the forefront leaders in Canada has been the Rain City Strategy in Vancouver, where they've spoken about just sort of very strong measurement on the quantification of the value of using such tree trenches. So in cities, how much water per hour falling on the city can be absorbed and meaningfully, essentially pre-filtered. And so I would point out that if people wish to know more, the Rain City Strategy in Vancouver is one of many actors. Montreal and other cities have also been advancing these initiatives. I would mention that the value of this area encouraged us as a federal government to support the creation of a natural infrastructure fund, which was really highly subscribed. So we had over 560 applications that sought $260 million. We had 150 million available. And right now we're going through the process of evaluating those requests for funding. But many of the proposals spoke to interest in mitigating risks associated with flooding, increased rainfall, heat waves, as well as erosion. There's a little image on the far right of shoreline restoration and a Green Shores approach. So the path ahead, as we turn here to open questions in the last 15 minutes or so, I had some discussion starters, which maybe I'll just mention that there's a lot of learning to be done very quickly in these domains. And I think I'll leave you with a few points, not on the screen here, but in a summative sense, as just before we turn to questions, I'd like to really propose that building community resilience to extreme weather and climate-driven events is essential. It saves money, it supports the economy, it protects quality of life. And truly, I think you've seen in Cal and Marianne's presentation, our commitments to recognizing that this is an age when the world is changing around us, and it behooves us to pursue swift learning, smarter decisions, and pursue systemic thinking. And standards have a key role in this, as well as the range of research done by the NRC. But the new knowledge that's being generated will be there to guide us to do things differently and to better protect Canadians and withstand future climate impacts. It also, though, is essential that creativity, empowerment, equity, and compassion are a part of this pursuit, because this is not just about protecting those who are already fortunate. It's very much about thinking globally and acting locally. And it's moving from that frame as well, though, to thinking longer term and acting now, because the future is coming fast. And truly, as many say in the domain of adaptation, I'll leave you with this. but that we must avoid what we cannot manage and manage what we cannot avoid, and do so with compassion. And we can no longer drive forward looking only in the rearview mirror. So with that, I open to questions. And Michelle Kranakia from our team, I think you may be looking at the chat. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. Hopefully things will work out here. And can somebody start to read our first question out? I'll start to open the chat. Question from Paul.
Hi, Chad.
Michelle.
Hi, I will review our questions in chronological order. So the first question was posed at 11:10 a.m. and it was, will the stack be provided for our review? Just so everyone is aware, Marianne responded, yes, the presentation will be up for review following the webinar. Question 2 was, given the rising influence of the political right and far left and of the political right and far right, with the real possibility that climate change deniers will be in control of government in the next parliamentary session and defunding of climate change action, what practical measures do you propose to address the issue of fact deniers?
You want me to try that one, Chad?
Sure, it's a fun
I'm
one.
happy to take. I'm happy to take that one. I think we have to look at what's driving action on adaptation, and it really is the $1 billion of costs to this country. And I mean, we know the climate is changing. There's evidence to that, but if we leave that aside, we can't afford not to adapt, or at least be prepared for the extreme events we're seeing now. And it's really, that is one of the drivers. The health is another driver. And I think, I really think that that is going to continue to drive the focus on adaptation for the foreseeable future. We live in a country that has a lot of weather. We've learned new words for weather, like derecho and heat dome, and atmospheric river is another one. So there is already that need to adapt to what we're seeing now. So you want to add something, Chad?
Oh, I think I really want to get through the questions. I'll just say super quickly, in one of the last elections, I saw major political parties had references to continuing our climate lens type of work, which is about resilience. So I was pleased to see a number across the political spectrum interest in this area. But gosh, I'm keen to get through more of these questions. This is great.
Thank you both. So moving on to our third question, which was posed by Gary Erickson at 11:26 a.m. Computer architect here. Wouldn't it be great to have one big dashboard with all data and goals tracked graphically through time for public stakeholder benefit?
Yeah, so Chad, I think this one might, you might be able to answer very quickly with the climate toolkit. So the good news is it's in the works.
Yeah, I would concur. I would say stay tuned. The United States has set kind of big shoes to try to follow in some regards with some of, and you may want to take a little look there. But there is definitely a commitment, whether it's release of federal flood maps across the country, but also in our commitment for a platform and toolkit. Some of that, glad to provide you more detail offline if you reach out to me. Happy to go to maybe our next question then, Michelle, from Leah, or...
Yes, so our next question was posted at 11:36 a.m. by Leah. Given that green building is moving toward a much higher use of wood as a sustainable material that stores carbon, in brackets, all good things, is the Canadian lumber industry being adapted to ensure our forests are not at risk? I understand that SFI and CSA certified wood does not require any enforcement of forestry standards, only statements of intention, and is industry driven, with clear cutting as the normal mode of operation. So have concerns about the accelerating degradation of our forests. Can we tie the use of wood in our buildings to sustainable forestry practices?
That's a tough one. Any thoughts?
I don't have the knowledge of the forestry sector to To
No,
answer,
neither.
I can speak to there's innovation on different types of forestry products as well, recycled materials and things like that, but I'm not familiar enough with forestry practices.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I can add to it. I know that there are, developing standards around things like urban and community forests to make sure that they're maintained, but I'm not knowledgeable enough in this area.
Okay. I think we should keep moving on here. The number of questions. There's the following one. I think, but speaking to, I might just jump in here, Michelle. It's Sylvia and Tom speaking to, are there opportunities associated with projected temperature increase, increased growing season, reduction of frost warnings? So yes, there are, like reduced snow loads on roofs, and it's something that we need to confront, both kind of the positives and the challenge of drawbacks in the near and longer term. But it's a longer question about what are the positives. Anything anybody else wants to add, my fellow panelists? Or
yeah, I can add. I think like things like freeze thaw cycles are going to increase in some areas and then disappear, so we'll see that impact on durability. As Chad mentioned too, the snow loads, we see them going down in many regions, but for now there's a cautious approach to that, making sure we're still designing for the maximum from historic and future projections. We might see opportunities there as the climate shifts and we move forward. One of the big takeaways though is the weather. We're just going to see more weather and, like, for example, more rain, warmer air holds more moisture, but unfortunately it's not going to all fall evenly across the board. So we're going to see more extremes, more droughts, more floods, and need to be prepared for that. So even if there are some benefits, it's not going to be evenly distributed.
That's great. And so, Michelle, I'll hand it back to you. I see like Jerry is probably the next question, 15-degree difference, but I'll just like jump to that one and then kind of hand this back to you. In fact, I'll just run through this one, and then we'll go back to you to carry on. So Jerry Chewalski is asking about, did I hear correctly? Is there a 15-degree difference? This is Cala in temperature between urban center and surrounding area.
Yeah, so I mean, I will depend on the city. There have been studies recently that cities are often, 10 to 15 degrees hotter than their rural surroundings. I know I'm based here in Ottawa, and I believe that there's up to a 12-degree difference between us and downtown Ottawa, and then even the Gatineau's just across the river. So it can be quite significant.
Okay. There's a number of comments and things that are a little bit outside our domain, like farming practices here. And ones that if we had more time than the 3 minutes that remains to delve into. So can I just see amongst my panelists, if you take any quick glances, or Michelle, anything you see as particularly that we should touch on? I mean, there's interesting questions here about swales and mosquito population. Bioswales, I guess our contact information would be available through Felix if people were not able to respond to questions that have been surfaced in the Q&A here. I do see Cala, Brian Lee, 1221 low rise building wind. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Marianne.
I can say something just on the mosquito population one. I think managing our water is important so we know where it's located, because I think if we don't properly manage floodwater, then we end up with water in locations where we don't want it. I'm not familiar with any specific studies on the impact of mosquito populations, but I think that's an interesting topic, and I'd also be interested in learning more.
Okay, any other? I see commentary and questions.
There's one here as well on mitigation and the intersection of mitigation adaptation that we didn't talk about greenhouse gas emissions today. A lot of the conversation around climate change is around greenhouse gas emissions. So today was very focused on adaptation, but that's not to say that we aren't looking at those intersections. So at the Research Council, we have a whole other program on greenhouse gas emission, low carbon materials, Obvious intersections include if we put an air conditioning in every single building to prevent overheating, we're going to be increasing the operational carbon of those buildings. So that's obviously a concern. So looking at how can we mitigate both overheating as well as ensure that we're on track for greenhouse emissions targets. So very much at the forefront of the research, looking at those intersections and ensuring we're addressing both. The reality is we have to do both. We need to mitigate to ensure that we don't have to adapt as much in the future, but we do have to adapt as well because we are seeing the consequences of extreme events and climate change already.
Okay, Felix, I think we're down to 1 minute left here. I think I look to you to kind of close us out, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Shadi. Thank you very much for a great presentation, Marianne also, and Carla. It was great having you with us. And this concludes today's webinar. Please allow me to just mention a few items. The next webinar takes place next week on March the 28th, also at 11 a.m. and the title, Embracing Digitization and AI in Architecture. As mentioned, the OAA will report your participation in this webinar to your transcript. Therefore, there is no need for individual reporting on your part. We kindly ask for your patience as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next few weeks. Additionally, all attendees will soon receive the presentation file via email along with a link to submit your feedback. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance and have a productive and pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.